The landscape of Ice Age Europe was brutal. Vast glaciers cut across the land, reshaping valleys and rivers, while icy winds swept across the open plains. In these unforgiving conditions, a new kind of human appeared. They were shorter than modern people, but their bodies were thick-set, their bones dense, and their muscles powerful. These were the Neanderthals, shaped by a world of cold and scarcity. Their emergence around 400,000 years ago marked one of the most profound experiments in human survival. Archaeological evidence shows that their ancestors likely branched from Homo heidelbergensis, a species that once ranged across Africa and Europe. While populations in Africa would eventually evolve into Homo sapiens, the groups who remained in Europe adapted to the harsher northern climate. Over generations, natural selection favored strength and endurance. Their bodies became stockier, their noses larger to warm the freezing air, and their brows heavier to shield deep-set eyes. Every detail of their anatomy was forged for survival. Life for Neanderthals was not easy, but they developed remarkable strategies to endure it. They learned to control fire, not merely as warmth, but as a tool for shaping their environment. Hearths discovered in European caves show that fire was central to their existence. Around its light, families cooked hunted meat, warmed their children, and kept predators at bay. In the dark winters of the Ice Age, fire was more than flame. It was a fragile barrier between life and extinction. Their tools also reveal a striking ingenuity. With careful precision, they shaped flint into sharp flakes and points. These were fitted onto wooden shafts to form spears that could bring down giant beasts of the Ice Age, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, and mammoths. The technique, known as Levallois technology, required foresight and planning. It was not brute instinct but deliberate craftsmanship. In the shards of stone left behind, archaeologists see minds capable of strategy and skill. Yet survival was never individual. Neanderthal life revolved around small groups bound by kinship. Evidence from sites, such as Shanidar Cave in Iraq, shows that they cared for their sick and elderly. One skeleton belonged to a man who had lost an arm and suffered severe injuries, yet lived for decades, a sign that others had tended to him. This reveals a society where compassion mattered as much as strength. In the harshest world, empathy became another form of survival. But their existence was never isolated. As Neanderthals evolved in Europe, far to the south in Africa, another branch of humanity was rising. There, under a different sun, Homo sapiens began to develop. Their bodies were taller, leaner, built for endurance running across open savannas. Their tools grew increasingly diverse, and their use of symbolic expression slowly expanded. For tens of thousands of years, these two human lineages developed apart, unaware of each other's fate. Still, the environment was never static. Ice ages came in cycles, with advancing glaciers forcing migrations and reshaping habitats. Neanderthals moved across vast regions, from Spain and France through the Middle East, into Central Asia, and as far as Siberia. Their range was enormous, a testament to their resilience. But with every migration came challenge, new landscapes, shifting prey, and rival predators. They were hunters, but also the hunted, competing with cave lions, hyenas, and bears for territory and food. Scientists reconstructing their world note that Neanderthals were not merely surviving, but also creating culture. In caves such as El Sidrón in Spain, evidence suggests social cooperation extended to ritual. Cut marks on bones, pigments, and simple ornaments point to people capable of symbolic thought. They were not brutes, wrote paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer, but close relatives who shared many of our behaviors. These early traces challenged the stereotype of Neanderthals as primitive. Their physical presence must have been striking. At roughly 5.5 feet tall, they carried massive frames. Their skulls were long and low, their jaws powerful. A Neanderthal standing in a cave mouth, spear in hand, would have seemed less like an ancestor and more like a rival species. Yet in them we glimpse echoes of ourselves, the drive to endure, the will to shape the world with tools, the need for one another's care. By 300,000 years ago, they were firmly established across Europe and Western Asia. They had weathered countless winters, learned to adapt to shifting climates, and mastered the rhythms of the hunt. For a time, they were the dominant human species across these lands. But the story of humanity is never still. Beyond Africa's deserts and grasslands, their cousins were preparing to move. The earliest stirrings of Homo sapiens migrations were beginning. With more versatile tools, wider networks of cooperation, and developing symbolic language, they carried within them advantages that would soon alter the balance of the world. For now, though, the Neanderthals stood unchallenged in the north, a species forged by ice and endurance, unaware that their greatest test had not yet come. Their birth as a species was both a triumph and a foreshadowing. The cold had made them strong, but the world was changing, and history rarely spares those who cannot change with it. The firelight that illuminated their caves was bright, but on the horizon, another flame was rising. The Ice Age was not a single frozen moment, but a shifting cycle of warmth and bitter cold. For Neanderthals, these rhythms defined existence. When glaciers advanced, forests shrank, forcing herds of animals into open plains. When ice retreated, valleys filled with rivers and vegetation. In every turn of this climate, Neanderthals adapted. They were not wanderers without thought, but skilled survivors who understood their land in ways only millennia of struggle could teach. Archaeologists uncover the story through fragments left behind: a circle of stones blackened by ancient fire, a scatter of bones bearing cut marks, a flint spear point lodged in the rib of a great beast. Each trace speaks of people who mastered both nature's violence and its gifts. At La Côte de Saint-Brelade, on the island of Jersey, evidence shows Neanderthals driving mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses into natural ravines, where the panicked animals could be slaughtered with spears. Such strategies required planning, teamwork, and courage. Hunting was never the act of an individual. It was the strength of the group that brought survival. Inside caves across Europe, the marks of daily life endure. At Kabra in Israel, a hearth still lies in the soil, its ash layers preserved for tens of thousands of years. The charred remains of plants and bones reveal meals cooked in the flickering light. Nearby, stone tools lie abandoned as if their owners had only just stepped away. In these details, Neanderthals appear not as shadows, but as families, bound by routine and shared labor. Care was not limited to hunting. In Shanidar Cave, deep in the mountains of Iraq, skeletons tell a different story. One Neanderthal, badly injured in youth, lived on for decades despite having lost an arm and suffering a crushed skull. Another shows signs of severe disability, yet survived well into adulthood. Their presence testifies to compassion, that the strong carried the weak, that the injured were fed, that survival was not only physical but social. These were communities where loyalty was as vital as strength. The tools they left behind reveal a mastery of stone unmatched for its time. The levallois technique, used widely by Neanderthals, was more than simple flaking. A stone core was prepared carefully, shaped until a single sharp flake could be struck with precision. These flakes became knives, scrapers, and spear tips. Unlike crude stone chopping, this method shows foresight and intention. At sites in France and Germany, thousands of such tools have been found, standardized in form, evidence of teaching and shared knowledge passed from one generation to the next. But their ingenuity did not end with stone. Neanderthals shaped bone and wood into useful tools. They tanned hides to fashion clothing, crucial for enduring sub-zero temperatures. They learned to control fire in ways that suggest not just reaction to chance lightning strikes, but deliberate use, sustaining flames and carrying embers to new camps. In the frozen landscapes of Ice Age Europe, fire was their constant companion, both protection and symbol of life. These skills gave Neanderthals dominance across Europe and Western Asia for nearly 300,000 years. They were apex hunters who knew the habits of reindeer, bison, and wild horses. They understood how to follow seasonal migrations, how to read the land for signs of prey. In caves like Grotte du Rhin in France, ornaments made of animal teeth and pigments suggest that survival was accompanied by symbolism. Color and decoration may have marked identity, status, or ritual, a glimpse into the beginnings of culture. Still, their world was harsh. Winters were long, and death was constant. Even the strongest hunters risked fatal injury in pursuit of massive prey. Diseases spread easily in small groups, and children often did not survive beyond infancy. Yet it was precisely this fragility that bound them together. Survival meant cooperation. Every hand mattered, from the elders who remember migration routes to the children who gathered firewood. To picture a Neanderthal camp is to see not chaos, but order. Spears leaned against cave walls. Hides stretched across wooden frames to dry. Families gathered around fire, sharing the day's catch, telling stories in a language still unknown to us. Scientists debate the extent of their speech, but the evidence of hyoid bones and brain capacity suggests they possessed vocal abilities similar to ours. Whatever their words, they were enough to plan, to teach, to comfort. The stereotype of Neanderthals as brutish cavemen lingers, but the evidence tells otherwise. They were people of resilience and intelligence, shaped by their environment, yet also shaping it in return. As paleoanthropologist John Jacobelin observed, they were not failed humans, but another way of being human. For tens of millennia, this way of being was successful. Neanderthals spread across a continent, adapted to climates that would break lesser creatures, and raised children who would carry knowledge into the next generation. They were masters of ice and stone, guardians of survival in an age when nature offered little mercy. And yet, beyond their familiar ranges, a change was coming. In Africa, their cousins, Homo Sapiens, were preparing to step beyond their cradle. Taller, leaner, more versatile in tools and art, they were beginning to move north. For the first time in human history, two distinct species would soon meet face to face. The Neanderthals did not know it, but their greatest challenge was no longer the mammoth, the cold, or the hunger. It was the arrival of a new kind of human, one that would not only share their world, but eventually transform it forever. Nearly 200,000 years after Neanderthals had carved their place in the cold landscapes of Europe, movement stirred far away. In the open plains and savannas of Africa, Homo sapiens were evolving into a formidable force. Their bodies were tall and lean, their strides suited for long pursuits under the sun. Their minds, though, were their true strength. More intricate tools, symbolic objects, and complex language were becoming part of their daily lives. Around 70,000 years ago, the first of these humans began to leave Africa. Step by step, across deserts and coastlines, they moved north, until eventually, they reached the Neanderthals' frontier. The earliest encounters occurred in the Middle East, in lands that are now Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. In caves such as Skul and Kafza, the remains of both species have been found within the same layers of soil. Here, two different kinds of humans stood face to face. For the Neanderthals, it must have been a moment of recognition and threat. These newcomers carried sharper blades, lighter frames, and the ability to coordinate in larger groups. For the Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals appeared powerful and stocky, with faces framed by heavy brows and deep eyes. They were rivals, but they were also kin. The nature of these first meetings remains uncertain, but the evidence suggests variety. In some places, conflict likely erupted. Spears and stones would have been raised, and groups fought for access to rivers, caves, and hunting grounds. Yet in other places, something more intimate occurred. DNA studies today reveal that interbreeding took place. Modern humans carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, and in some populations, even more. This genetic inheritance tells us that where violence marked some meetings, others were shaped by alliance, trade, and even love. Archaeologists note that Neanderthal tools and Homo sapiens artifacts sometimes appear side by side, suggesting a period of exchange. Shell beads and pigments, once thought to belong exclusively to modern humans, are also found in Neanderthal contexts. Perhaps both species influenced one another, learning and adapting in the process. What emerges is not a simple story of conquest, but of contact, a mingling of lineages that would echo down the generations. Still, the balance was fragile. The Neanderthals lived in smaller groups, often only a few dozen at most. Their societies were intimate, each member playing a critical role. The Homo sapiens, by contrast, could form larger bands, linked by shared language and broader cooperation. With more flexible networks, they adapted quickly, moving across landscapes with remarkable speed. In this difference lay a decisive advantage. The climate, once again, shaped destiny. As the last great ice age advanced, resources grew scarcer. Herds shifted, forests thinned, and rivers froze. Competition for food grew fierce. Where once Neanderthals had been unrivaled in their environment, they now faced a species that could outnumber, outplan, and outlast them. Anthropologist Ofer Bar-Yosef once remarked, "The arrival of modern humans was not just a migration. It was a revolution in the human landscape." Yet it would be wrong to imagine this as a sudden replacement. For thousands of years, Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted. In some valleys, Neanderthal groups thrived, holding onto their hunting grounds with skill and knowledge of the land. In others, modern humans settled, spreading slowly but steadily. The two species lived in a patchwork of dominance, sometimes overlapping, sometimes avoiding one another. But the genetic evidence cannot be ignored. The fact that their DNA remains inside us means that children were born of these unions. They were raised in camps where the firelight must have illuminated faces of mixed heritage, the stocky build of one lineage, the finer features of another. We cannot know their names or their lives, but their legacy is written in our blood. Every modern person of Eurasian descent carries fragments of Neanderthal ancestry, a quiet testament to these early connections. Still, beneath this mingling, the tide was shifting. With every passing century, the numbers of Homo sapiens grew. Their innovations multiplied. Bone needles for sewing tighter clothes, blades crafted from fine stone, symbolic carvings etched into ivory. Their ability to communicate in more complex language allowed larger groups to share knowledge across generations. Slowly, the strangers became the majority. For the Neanderthals, this marked the beginning of retreat. They were not defeated in a single battle, nor erased in a single moment. Instead, they were slowly outcompete, their territories shrinking as modern humans spread across the continent. Some groups interbred and were absorbed. Others clung to isolated strongholds, their fires burning against the growing dark. The arrival of strangers was both a connection and a turning point. It was the moment when humanity's story branched and intertwined, when two species shared the same land and, for a time, the same lives. But it was also the beginning of the end for the Neanderthals' long reign. What followed was not a swift conquest, but a slow, inevitable contest of survival. The next chapters of this story reveal how the Neanderthals, once masters of ice and stone, faced the greatest rival of all, not the mammoth, not the lion, not the cold, but another kind of human whose rise would reshape the world. By the time Homo sapiens had reached Europe in larger numbers, the balance of survival had already begun to shift. Neanderthals, once the undisputed masters of Ice Age landscapes, now faced a rival who multiplied more quickly, moved more widely, and adapted with striking flexibility. The contest between them was not decided in a single clash, but in countless small struggles over land, food, and endurance. Archaeological layers show how the territories of Neanderthals grew narrower as modern humans spread. In the Levant, both species alternated occupation of the same caves, sometimes separated by only a few centuries. In Europe, Neanderthal bands retreated into refuges as the newcomers expanded. This shrinking presence was not simply about numbers. It was also about strategy. While Neanderthals had mastered the art of ambush hunting in familiar valleys, Homo sapiens could adjust to new terrain, invent new techniques, and cooperate in larger groups. Tools reflect this difference. Neanderthals relied heavily on sturdy, close-range weapons, thrusting spears designed for face-to-face combat with massive prey. These demanded strength and courage, but also carried risk. By contrast, modern humans develop lighter projectiles and more refined blades, allowing them to hunt from a distance and with greater safety. The advantage was not in raw strength, but in efficiency. Each hunt cost the Neanderthals more, while sapiens gained more with less risk. Disease may have been another silent weapon. Genetic studies suggest that when the two species came into contact, pathogens carried by larger human populations spread into Neanderthal groups. With their smaller numbers and limited genetic diversity, Neanderthals may have been especially vulnerable. Illness that was survivable for sapiens could devastate Neanderthal families, eroding their ability to recover. Survival was no longer just a matter of strength against the cold. It was a contest against invisible enemies. Climate change added another burden. The period between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago was marked by sudden swings in temperature. Ice advanced and retreated, reshaping ecosystems at a pace that tested all living things. For Neanderthals, whose traditions were tied closely to specific landscapes, rapid shifts meant disruption of hunting grounds and loss of familiar resources. For sapiens, however, adaptability was their defining trait. They ranged farther, created broader networks, and exchanged knowledge that allowed them to adjust to change. The Neanderthals' strength had always been their close-knit groups, bound by loyalty and memory. Yet this intimacy also limited them. Groups rarely numbered more than a few dozen. In contrast, modern humans could organize bands of hundreds, linked through shared symbols, rituals, and language. This allowed not only larger hunts, but also broader exchange of ideas. With every generation, sapiens accumulated more cultural knowledge, and with it, more advantage. Still, this was not an outright extermination. There is little evidence of large-scale battles between the species. Instead, the contest played out in the slow encroachment of sapiens on Neanderthal territories. As modern humans moved into new valleys, Neanderthals were forced to retreat. In some places, they lingered, maintaining their way of life as long as they could. In others, they interbred, their identity absorbed into the larger population. The result was not a sudden disappearance, but a gradual fading from history. Even so, Neanderthals showed resilience. Sites in Spain, Croatia, and southern France reveal that they persisted in pockets long after sapiens arrived. In Gibraltar, evidence suggests Neanderthals survived until around 40,000 years ago, thousands of years after most of their kin had gone. Their ability to endure in isolated refuges shows that they were not easily swept aside. They fought for their existence until the very end. The contest, however, was uneven. As sapiens spread, they brought with them art, wider trade networks, and symbolic expression that reinforced group identity. Cave paintings in places like Chauvet and ornaments crafted from ivory reveal a people who could imagine beyond survival. Neanderthals, though capable of symbolic behavior, did not produce cultural expressions on the same scale. In a contest not only of survival but of legacy, sapiens began to dominate the story of humanity. Yet this contest was not without exchange. Genetic evidence shows repeated episodes of interbreeding, especially in the Middle East and Central Asia. Traits such as immune system adaptations in modern humans come directly from Neanderthals. Even as they lost ground, Neanderthals left an enduring mark. Their genes remain alive in the blood of billions today, reminders that their struggle was not in vain. By 45,000 years ago, the trajectory was clear. Sapiens were spreading into every corner of Europe and Asia, while Neanderthal numbers dwindled. The contest for survival was ending, not with conquest, but with absorption, attrition, and the relentless pressure of change. The fate of the Neanderthals is both tragedy and inheritance. Tragedy, because the people who had endured for hundreds of thousands of years were slowly erased from the earth. Inheritance, because part of them still endures in us. As anthropologist Van Apabo, who sequenced the Neanderthal genome, observed, they are not gone completely. They live on in small parts of every one of us. The contest was over, but the story was not. From the ashes of Neanderthal endurance rose the age of Homo Sapiens, a species that would expand beyond continents, across oceans, and eventually into the skies. But before that expansion could begin, another chapter would unfold. The final days of the Neanderthals, as their last fires burned in the caves of southern Europe. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals' world had narrowed to fragments. Once they had ranged from Spain to Siberia, their hunting bands roaming icebound valleys and river plains. Now their presence was confined to scattered pockets, the caves of southern France, the limestone cliffs of Croatia, and the rocky outposts of Gibraltar. In these refuges, the last Neanderthal families clung to survival, their fires burning low against the dark tide of extinction. Archaeological traces reveal the contours of these final days. In Gorham's Cave on the southern tip of Gibraltar, Charcoal hearths and flint tools lie in layers, dating to the last millennia of Neanderthal existence. Here, in the shadow of cliffs that face the Mediterranean, families may have watched unfamiliar sails pass by, evidence of expanding Homo sapiens networks. The coast offered fish, birds, and shellfish, new foods that Neanderthals turned to as traditional prey grew scarce. These adaptations show resilience, but they were not enough to reverse decline. Numbers were their greatest enemy. While modern humans multiplied across Europe, Neanderthal groups remained small, often no more than 20 to 30 individuals. Each death, from hunger, injury, or disease, was a heavier blow. Genetic studies suggest inbreeding had increased, weakening resilience. Where once their strength had been their close bonds, it now became a trap. The networks that had carried them through centuries were too narrow to withstand such pressures. Climate delivered another wound. Around the time Neanderthals were retreating, sudden cold pulses swept across Europe. Forests receded, prey animals shifted south, and landscapes that had once been familiar hunting grounds became barren. For modern humans, whose flexible strategies allowed wider cooperation and longer migrations, these shifts could be absorbed. For Neanderthals, tied more closely to specific ranges and traditions, each change eroded stability. Still, their final days were not without humanity. In El Sidron Cave in Spain, remains suggest families continued to live and die together, sharing food and shelter. In Shanidar, evidence of burials persisted, with bodies carefully placed in graves, sometimes accompanied by flowers and pigments. These rituals, however modest, show that even as their numbers dwindled, Neanderthals retained a sense of meaning beyond survival. They looked at death not as disposal, but as remembrance. One can imagine a last hunting party, spears in hand, stalking through a snow-swept valley. The hunters would have carried the weight of generations, techniques passed from elders, stories told around firelight. Yet each hunt grew more perilous, each return less certain. The great beasts of the Ice Age were dwindling, driven south or hunted by rival humans. Scarcity pressed harder with every year. Interactions with Homo sapiens continued. In some regions, interbreeding occurred until the end, as shown by genetic evidence from fossils in Romania and Russia. But these encounters could not save the Neanderthals as a people. Each child of mixed heritage marked another thread absorbed into the expanding sapiens tapestry. In a sense, their end was not sudden disappearance, but quiet assimilation. By 39,000 years ago, most Neanderthal groups had vanished. Gibraltar's caves may have sheltered the last survivors. Here, on the edge of Europe, small fires flickered in the dark, illuminating faces heavy-browed, yet still human, still bound by kinship. These fires were symbols of endurance, but also of fragility. When the embers cooled, no one remained to rekindle them. The archaeological record captures the silence that followed. No more Neanderthal hearths appear in the soil layers. No more distinctive stone tools. The once vast footprint of their presence ends abruptly. It is a silence that carries weight, the silence of a species whose voice was lost. And yet, their story does not close with erasure. In our DNA, fragments of Neanderthal life persist. Genes that shape our immune systems, our hair, even our moods can trace lineage to those last survivors. As geneticist Svante Pääbo explained, Neanderthals are not entirely gone. They live on in us, in small pieces that remind us we were never alone. The last fires of the Neanderthals fade not as a defeat in battle, but as a slow, inevitable merging with history. Their extinction is a tragedy, but also a reminder. Survival is not only about strength, but about adaptability, networks, and chance. They endured for hundreds of thousands of years, longer than modern humans have so far existed. Their disappearance, measured against such endurance, was less a failure than a testament to the precariousness of life in a changing world. In the caves of Gibraltar, in the valleys of France, in the mountains of Iraq, their traces remain. Footprints hardened in mud, tools buried in ash, bones laid to rest with care. Each fragment is a whisper of resilience, a reminder that these people were not others, but part of us. The fires they tended lit not only their caves, but the human story itself. From those last embers rose the unchallenged age of Homo sapiens. Yet in every flame we light, every stone we shape, every bond we form, echoes of the Neanderthals endure. When the last Neanderthal fires went dark, the world did not immediately notice. Forests continued to shift, rivers carved new paths, and herds of reindeer still traced ancient migrations. But humanity itself had changed forever. The age of Neanderthals had ended, yet their presence never truly vanished. In the bodies of modern humans, in the patterns of our genes, and in the very story of what it means to endure, the Neanderthals still remain. Genetic research in recent decades has revealed what archaeology alone could not. In 2010, the first draft of the Neanderthal genome was published, and with it came a revelation. Every person of Eurasian descent carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. Across Asia and Europe, echoes of their inheritance persist. In some regions, that percentage is even higher. These are not abstract numbers. They are fragments of a people woven into the fabric of who we are. The influence of this legacy is surprisingly tangible. Certain immune system genes in modern humans are traced directly to Neanderthals, helping our ancestors resist new diseases as they spread into unfamiliar lands. Other traits, linked to skin tone, hair, or even metabolism, also carry Neanderthal signatures. In some ways, they prepared us for survival in climates they once mastered. Even now, scientists uncover connections between Neanderthal genes and aspects of mood, sleep, and resilience to illness. Their inheritance is not merely physical. It has shaped how we live. But the echo is not only biological. It is cultural, symbolic, and moral. The discoveries of hearths, ornaments, pigments, and burials remind us that Neanderthals were not beasts on the edge of humanity, but participants in its earliest chapters. They too painted, carved, cared, and mourned. In caves such as La Pasiega and El Sidron in Spain, handprints and geometric designs etched in ochre suggest minds capable of symbolic thought. These marks are not random, they are evidence of meaning. When we trace art back to its origins, Neanderthals are there beside us. Their survival across hundreds of thousands of years is itself a lesson in endurance. Few species in human history have lasted as long. They endured cycles of ice and thaw, predators as fierce as lions, and climates that demanded unyielding strength. Their extinction was not because they were weak or dull. It was because the world changed faster than their small bands could adapt, and because they met a rival whose advantages lay in cooperation, language, and innovation. Yet even in loss, their story continues inside us. The relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was never simple. It was conflict, yes, but also contact. It was rivalry, but also intimacy. Some of the earliest unions between the two species produced children whose descendants still walk among us. In them lies the most powerful reminder of all. The boundary between us and them was never absolute. It was porous, human, and shared. The story of modern humanity cannot be told without acknowledging the Neanderthals who shaped it. For centuries, Western thought cast Neanderthals as brutish, backward, and inferior. The heavy brow ridges, the stocky frames, the absence of written language, all were taken as proof of primitiveness. Yet with every new discovery, that image has unraveled. Compassion in Shanidar, art in Spain, survival in Gibraltar. These are not the signs of a failed species, but of a people who lived fully within their time. As paleoanthropologist Joao Zilho wrote, "The line between us and them is not a gulf, but a thread." The extinction of the Neanderthals is also a mirror held to ourselves. It shows that dominance in history is fragile, that even the strongest can fall, and that survival often belongs not to the most powerful, but to the most adaptable. It raises questions that echo into our own age. What happens when resources collapse? When climates shift beyond endurance? When smaller groups are overshadowed by larger, more numerous rivals? The fate of the Neanderthals reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, not even for those who once seemed unshakable. And yet, they are not gone. Every time scientists map the human genome, every time we uncover ancient tools in a cave, every time a hand stencil is revealed beneath layers of dust, the Neanderthals speak again. Their voice may be quiet, but it has not been silenced. It lingers in the double helix of our cells, in the deep time of memory, in the unbroken chain of humanity. The echoes in our blood are not only scientific, they are symbolic. They remind us that humanity is plural, that the story of who we are was never written by one species alone. The Neanderthals walked with us for millennia, and in a sense, they still walk with us now. Their legacy endures in our bodies, in our culture, and in the humility they teach. That we, too, are but a chapter in the larger book of life. As we look back across the gulf of 40,000 years, the Neanderthals do not vanish into myth. They remain in every fire we build, in every tool we craft, in every bond of care we form. Their last fires may have faded, but their light burns still, carried within us. That's it for today. Subscribe for more, and drop your country's name in the comments.